Okay, everyone. So good evening and welcome to our second webinar in our 4-part breeding series. I'm Rebecca from Kentucky Equine Research, and I'm joined by a few other members of our technical and nutrition team this evening. So we've got Dr. Peter Huntington, Director of Nutrition, and Peter delivered our webinar on broodmare nutrition a couple of weeks ago. We've also got David Nash, who is our Director of Nutrition Technology, and David's actually presenting our next webinar in the series on the 3rd of September, and that is all about maximising conception and fertility. And then, of course, we've got Dr. Clarissa Brown-Douglas, who'll be delivering our presentation on young horse nutrition this evening. So Clarissa has been a nutritionist with Kentucky Equine Research for the last 15 or so years, and she earned her PhD in equine growth and development in 2003, I think it was. And she's been instrumental in contributing huge quantities of data to KER GrowTrack, which is the world's largest thoroughbred growth database. Her experience goes well beyond just thoroughbreds though, and she regularly looks after breeds and studs of various breeds all around the world. So just before we get started, please feel free to ask any questions that you would like to throughout Clarissa's presentation. For those of you logged on via Zoom, you can do this in the Q&A section. And for those of you that are watching via the live streaming, other live streaming platforms, you can just put a comment in with your question, and we'll do our best to get back to you throughout the presentation, and we'll also have some time at the end. So with that, I'll pass over to Clarissa to take you through tonight's presentation.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's certainly a novel experience for us to be presenting this webinar without an audience, but hopefully there's a few of you watching. I have no idea how many people are out there, but you know, it is a bonus to not be standing in front of a room full of people, because I get to wear my tracksuit pants and have a sneaky glass of wine while I'm doing this. So anyway, I hope you're all kicking back and enjoying the evening, and hopefully this will take your mind off a few of the more pressing and concerning events that are happening in this world at the moment. So thank you very much for attending. The seminar this evening, just try and make sure that this is working. I thought I'd just give you a wee outline of what I'll be covering. We'll be talking about some of our growth data that we've been studying, looking at the growth rates of different horses and different breeds, and then how to feed these horses so that we have a fabulous athlete at the end of it all. I'll talk about various feeding scenarios for weanlings and yearlings, and look at developmental orthopedic disease, because of course no young growing horse nutrition talk is complete without talking about that. And then at the end, I'll talk about some of the bone research that Kentucky Equine Research has been carrying out. So when we talk about equine growth, this is an area that's been studied a little bit recently, but when we compare horses to other production animals, it certainly hasn't been studied to the point that it might have been done with meat-producing animals such as cattle and sheep. A horse isn't obviously grown to be grown as rapidly as possible in a short amount of time. Therefore, when we're growing horses, we're talking about optimal growth. We want the animal to be grown so that it's a sound athlete at the end of it all. So they're not selected for feed conversion efficiency or a certain type of muscling, for example. And I like this, this graph here because it shows us that we're aiming for optimal growth. If we grow too rapidly, like you might a beef cattle, for example, you're going to end up with problems usually related to the skeleton with developmental orthopedic disease. If we grow too slowly, you'll end up with a weak, underdone individual that you don't want at the end of it all. Now, regardless of the future career for the horse, their pattern of growth is very similar. They have a relatively rapid increase in body weight during the first few months of life. It plateaus out over the winter months. And generally, regardless of the breed, a horse will reach its mature size at about 4 to 5 years of age. Now, there are obviously some later maturing horses and some earlier maturing horses, but the rate in which they're growing is determined by their future career. There are some industries which do demand large, rapidly growing horses at a younger age. The one that comes to mind, of course, is the thoroughbred industry and the standardbred industry, and to a certain extent, the quarter horse industry as well. We want these horses to be looking really mature at quite a young age. But of course, we know that sound and steady growth is important for a healthy skeleton. So we always recommend that horse breeders will monitor the growth of their horses and compare that growth against a known growth curve so that these growth rates can be controlled. And certainly we've been working at collecting data from all sorts of breeds into a growth tracking program called GrowTrack, which allows horse breeders to enter the weight of their young horses and compare them with a reference curve, as you might when you're growing kids and measuring them at the paediatrician each month. It's highly recommended. It's not routinely performed on a lot of farms because obviously scales are expensive and weighing horses is time consuming, but it certainly helps to manage the growth of young horses. Some of the work that's been done on growing horses we know a fair amount about. For example, birth weights, that's been studied a lot. Generally in most breeds, the horse is born at about 10% of their mature weight. Bigger horses or heavier horses tend to be smaller, and Shetland ponies, for example, or the small ponies are going to be a greater percentage of their mature weight when they're born. But what's interesting is that their skeleton is incredibly immature. The bone mineral content of a newborn foal is about 17% of its mature bone mineral content. So an awful lot of mineral has to be laid down in the skeleton when they're growing. We know that some management factors will affect birth weight. We know that larger mares have larger foals. Mares that are between the ages of 7 and 11 have larger foals, interestingly enough, and those that have foaled before will have a bigger foal generally. We also know there's a seasonal factor, so foals born earlier in the season will be smaller than those born later in the season, except for sometimes the ones right out at the end. When we look at body weights and growth of the young foal, or the foal through to weaning, it's a period of extremely rapid growth. So we have a situation where in a few weeks, or nearly a month and a half, the animal's going to double its birth weight. So a 50 kilo foal, for example, is going to be 100 kilos at about 5 weeks of age. So that's a period of extremely rapid weight gain. So we're looking at horses gaining, and this is a horse such as a thoroughbred gaining a kilo a day in those early weeks. At 6 months of age, you'll expect to see under half of their mature weight, but nearly 85% of their mature height. So they've grown a lot of skeleton in that time. When we look at the growth period from weaning to yearling, this is more of a function of seasonal factors. So you'll see a slowing off of growth rates after weaning. Often that can be quite extreme, relating to the stress of weaning. And interestingly enough, in weanlings, you'll often see the incidence of gastric ulcers due to the stress of weaning, which is quite concerning. There'll also be a declining average daily gain due to the cold weather and the decrease in pasture quality during this time. The average daily gain is then will then increase again in the spring, and this is related to increase in pasture growth and also the onset of puberty. And so at around 12 months of age, the horse is about over 60% of its mature weight and nearly reached its full height. This particular image here is taken using some data that we've collected from thoroughbred populations around the world. It's got about 25,000 horses in the data set. And you can look there that we've graphed the average daily gain of these growing thoroughbreds at each month of age. These are from various populations in different countries, obviously, but you can see here that the pattern's very similar. Horses in their first few months are gaining over 1 kilo a day on average, which drops down throughout the winter to about 0.5 kilo per day. And then you can see in the springtime, or at 11, 12, 13 months of age, these horses are then gaining weight again. So that's relating to seasonal factors. And then further out towards 16, 17 months, yearling preparation will then have an effect on weight gain. Interestingly enough, the Indian thoroughbreds, which are also commercially raised, don't show that spring increase in average daily gain, and that's relating to the climate in which they're grown. So it goes without saying that the nutrition of a growing horse is really important. These are our future athletes, whether we're going to be show jumping or trail riding or racing. We do want the horse to be sound. It's clear that they're gaining a lot of body condition during that time. And looking at that bone mineral statistic, it's a period of rapid skeletal growth. Minerals are being deposited within that bone at a great rate. So we've got to provide them with those substrates to grow that bone. During this time, if you make any mistakes nutritionally, it can influence their soundness later on in life. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Huntington, our esteemed colleague, was talking about broodmare nutrition, and obviously laying the foundation for a sound foal comes from broodmare nutrition. He pointed out that the growth of a young foal in utero isn't linear. So these horses are growing relatively slowly during the first 7 months of gestation, but that last trimester of pregnancy is when an awful lot of weight gain is occurring. The last trimester of pregnancy is also really important for the young horse's skeleton, and this is a time where the young fetal foal will store important trace minerals in its liver for use after it's born. And this is particularly related to copper and zinc, but also to a lesser extent manganese and iron. So it's important for your broodmares to ensure they're getting the right amount of trace minerals towards the end of pregnancy. When the foal's on the ground, provided the mare is producing decent amounts of milk, mare's milk's perfectly balanced to provide the foal with what they need during the first couple of months. However, it's well known that these babies will start to eat solid food very, very early on. Digestibility of mare's milk is very, very high, and the amount that they produce is a huge, huge amount. So thoroughbred mares will produce sometimes up to 20 kilos of milk per day. And the frequency of nursing obviously decreases as the animal ages and as the proportion of solid food increases in its diet. If you're unlucky enough to have an orphan foal, it's important to provide them with alternative nutrition. If they're orphaned at birth and they haven't had an opportunity to nurse, then the animal must be provided with colostrum, which you can access from colostrum banks, and that needs to be tubed and fed within 24 hours because that's the time that the gut is permeable to those large immunoglobulins that they require for immunity. A nurse mare is obviously ideal to raise that baby, but if those of us who are not living on amazing farms with a supply of nurse mares, we'll have to bottle feed our babies. And so there's certainly equine milk replacers available that are being nutritionally matched to mare's milk. And a lot of people will bottle feed, but a lot of people will teach their babies to drink from a bucket. And this is done with quite easily, surprisingly, but essentially you fill up a bucket with a very small amount of milk replacer, allow that foal's muzzle to hit the bottom of the bucket, and that will teach them or encourage them to drink that milk. And it works quite well. Certainly older foals that are orphaned, once they've had a few weeks on the ground, can grow quite adequately if you do provide them with a breeding feed and as well as their milk replacer. And these orphans can often be weaned early, so as long as they're accustomed to eating solid food. So I mentioned before that foals will start nibbling on their mum's food. They'll copy her and eat pasture and eat hay. And so certainly at 5 months of age, they're well and truly established eating pasture, hay and solid food. A lot of the time, a lot of the questions we're asked are when to introduce concentrate or hard feed to young horses. And if you have a look at this graph, this is a graph showing the energy requirement or the calorie requirement of a young foal, superimposed on a graph of the calories provided by the mare's milk. And you can see that peak lactation in the mare is at about 2 to 3 months, and that drops off over time. So where those curves diverge at about 2 to 3 months is when we say that you probably need to be introducing a concentrate feed. Although they might be getting enough energy from the roughage, it's important to provide that foal with balanced nutrition at the same time. A lot of farms, especially when they're managing their nutrition really carefully, will feed a specific breeding feed for young horses, and this is termed creep feeding in a lot of industries. Essentially, it's allowing the foal to have access to its own feed and preventing the mare from eating it. And this certainly is advantageous in certain situations, especially if you're unsure of the mare's milk production or the foal isn't gaining as much weight as you'd like it to on the mare. It also is helpful when the mare excludes the baby from the feed bin, or if you're aiming for a weanling sale or an early yearling sale and you want that baby to be growing more rapidly. So when we talk about feeding the weanling, this is a really critical time. A lot of farms will manage their weanlings. They'll wean them from the mare. They'll turn them out into groups and not actually provide them with any supplementary feed until they bring them in for initial work as yearlings, etc. But this is a time where balanced nutrition is really important. It's certainly an area that's been identified as a window for the development of some skeletal problems. And so it's certainly important to provide the right substrates to grow that skeleton. It's also an important time to monitor growth because they can certainly drop off a lot during these winter months, or those on really good roughage can gain an awful lot of weight as well. There are different scenarios that we would recommend for different breeds and types of horses. And it's tricky when we do a broad talk like this because obviously what one might feed a weanling pony to what one might feed a weanling Clydesdale is going to be quite different. If we're looking at a slow and steady growth curve, or horses that are not required to be looking round and show pony-like at weaning sale or yearling sale, this is where we want to control and monitor growth so that they don't get too fat. So warm bloods, quarter horses, Arabs, ponies, heavy horses, etc., or thoroughbreds not destined for the sale. And if they're on decent pasture, then a balancer pellet that's been formulated to have decent amounts of protein and vitamins and minerals is a perfect accompaniment to that diet to ensure that they're growing well. If you're not lucky enough to have decent pasture, then you've got to provide them with quality hay. And this can be anywhere from lucerne to good quality grass hay, cereal hay, and potentially adding a higher calorie feed or a breeding feed at a higher intake to ensure that these horses are still gaining condition and getting the nutrition they need. Those of you who are prepping horses for weanling or yearling sale will probably need to be having them on a higher plane of nutrition because you're wanting them to grow faster. So these are your thoroughbreds, standardbreds, and futurity quarter horses. So obviously we want to be looking at quality forage, so you'll probably be supplementing that pasture with some lucerne or cereal hay, feeding a full breeding feed at 2 to 3 kilos per day, or you can feed a balancer and top up those calories with grains such as oats, barley, or fibre sources such as beet pulp, oil, or stabilised rice bran. All of these work very well with young growing horses. As I mentioned at the beginning, it goes without saying we can't have a growth talk without talking about developmental orthopedic disease, although this topic is certainly a talk in itself. So I'll just summarise some of the main points. DOD, or developmental orthopedic disease, is an umbrella term which describes a group of diseases affecting the skeleton in young horses. It It's certainly a stressful group of diseases. It's a great cause of wastage in young horses. It's a reason why a lot of horses don't make it to yearling sales or don't make it to the racetrack. The main diseases that are a concern are physitis or epiphysitis, osteochondritis dissecans or OCD, and then there's others that I won't go into great detail about: wobbler syndrome, angular and flexural limb deformities. Physitis is one that I wanted to talk about tonight because I've actually had a couple of queries from horse breeders recently about this problem. It's an inflammation of the growth plate of the long bone of horses, and it's often seen in rapidly growing young stock. This wee foal here, I've got his fetlock circled, or his distal M3C3 bones, and this is where we see physitis occurring in young weanlings. We see it in the knee or the distal radius in yearling horses. Inflammation is usually characterised by swelling or a flared appearance of the growth plates. There might be heat in the joints and lameness present. Interestingly, physitis is not as much of a concern as it used to be, because we are well aware that provided the horse stays sound and you don't cause any damage to those very active growth plates, this condition will resolve itself once that bone remodels and those growth plates close up. Here's just a photo I took out in the field of a young warm blood that had physitis in its bottom of its distal cannon bones, and this is a thoroughbred that I've worked with distal radial physitis in the knee. So quite a severe case there where the horse had to be stable because it was unsound. OCD, probably the biggest DOD issue that we see, and this is a disturbance of the articular cartilage, so the cartilage within the joint of the horse. It's characterised by damage to the cartilage where you might see fissures or a flap of cartilage, and it's usually diagnosed with lameness or swelling in the joint, and mostly it's diagnosed under radiographs, so often it's subclinical. You don't see evidence of it, except it does come up in pre-sale radiographs. So it's a bit of a problem for people who are x-raying horses for sale. Surgery is usually considered if it looks like it might be not able to be healed prior to a certain event, such as a sale. And it's certainly considered if it looks like it's not going to heal itself. So there are many factors that do contribute to these developmental orthopedic diseases, and certainly nutrition does have a part to play, but also the genetics of the horse, the environment and climate that they're in, how they're managed, and also injury or mechanical stress, so stress from being overweight essentially and overloading that growing skeleton. AER's done a lot of work looking at body size of horses or the growth of horses and the link with joint disease, and this is a very small snapshot of some of the work that we've been looking at, evaluating the relationship between size and skeletal problems, and then actually going on and looking at whether these incidences of OCD affect the horse as a performance horse down the track. This particular data is from a study of over 300 foals in Kentucky over 4 years, and these were thoroughbreds that had survey radiographs taken during the winter of their yearling year, and then these horses then went on to have sales x-rays taken further down the track. But what we found was that 16% of the horses in this study had radiographically diagnosed OCD in multiple joints, but mostly the hock, but also stifle and fetlock as well. So what they found was that during that first month of age, foals that were heavier than the average of the population had a 3 times greater chance of developing OCD. So that bottom left-hand graph shows the incidence of OCD by weight quartile. So essentially we took all those foals, we had their weights as babies, so between 1 and 30 days, and then ranked them from the heaviest to the lightest. The heaviest horses are in the 4th quartile, the lightest are in the 1st. So you can see here that the incidence of OCD was significantly higher in those babies that were very, very big, 3rd and 4th quartile for height and 4th quartile for weight. But it's not just big horses that are at risk of developing OCDs, it's also irregular growth rates. So fluctuating growth rates where a horse might drop off or not get looked at properly and not be gaining as much weight, and then suddenly get fed an awful lot and have a massive growth spurt. And this is where we run into problems too. So non-uniform growth rates are a problem. Therefore, again, it's really important that we monitor the growth of these young horses so that we prevent this drop off in growth rate. As I mentioned, the period between weanling and yearling is thought to be a window of vulnerability for skeletal disease. So again, this is an important time to be weighing your horses. So nutrition does play a role, or can play a role, in these joint diseases. Usually they're related to various nutrients, such as the various calories, but also trace minerals and macro minerals as well. And we look at deficiencies in these excesses and imbalances in this nutrition. So when we're looking at mineral deficiencies or excesses, you can see they're usually linked to the major bone and cartilage forming nutrients. So the ones that we're most interested in when we're working out why this horse might be suffering from skeletal disease, we're looking at the macros, calcium and phosphorus, and then the trace minerals, copper and zinc. Interestingly, for most minerals, horses can tolerate pretty high levels, but hugely excess amounts of these will cause some sort of toxicity and certainly lead to developmental problems if we've got them massively out of balance. Interestingly, high levels of some nutrients will lead to secondary mineral deficiency where for example, massive amounts of calcium can interfere with the absorption of other important minerals such as phosphorus, zinc and iodine. So we need to make sure that our minerals are in the right amount and also in the right balance. So how do we muck up our mineral balance? Well, basically, it's usually by making an inappropriate nutrition choice for these young horses. And so common scenarios that we see are things like feeding a mature horse feed, so a feed that's been designed for a senior horse or a performance horse, to a growing horse. So this is usually not going to have enough protein in it to support growth, and it's certainly not going to have enough trace minerals for skeletal growth. Another scenario we see is when people feed straight cereal grains such as barley, oats or maize with no additional vitamin and mineral mix, so no balancer or vitamin and mineral premix to balance that nutrition that's lacking in those grains. Grains are a great energy source, but not so great when it comes to some of those trace minerals. Another scenario which a lot of people fall into the trap of is feeding a commercially available premixed feed at below the recommended rate. So these feeds have been the feeds that you see on the market, regardless of the brand, have been formulated for a specific purpose. They're formulated to be fed at a certain intake per day. So if you feed half or a quarter of the amount to the horse because they don't necessarily need the calories, you're only feeding a quarter to a half of the amount of the nutrients that they need. And this also happens when you're diluting those feeds with straight cereal grains as well. And so all of those scenarios can be very easily rectified by feeding a concentrate feed balancer, which doesn't contain terribly many calories, but it's got a good base of nutrition for growth. Mineral imbalance is another one that I often encourage people not to worry about too much because provided you're working with a nutritionist or a good feed company, they're going to be taking these balances into account. But calcium and phosphorus ratio is one that I'm sure all of you have heard about. Ideally should be around 1.5 calcium to 1 phosphorus in their total diet. Zinc to copper is another one that's important for young horses, should be around 3 or 4 to 1. So the best method of diagnosing a balanced diet or working out if there are deficiencies or excesses in the diet is through ration evaluation. So I highly recommend people have their roughage tested, make sure their hay is provided with a hay test, their pastures are analysed, and they know what they're feeding their horses. And this is the way we can work out exactly whether those horses are getting the right diet. A lot of people do rely on blood tests and hair and hoof analysis to determine if there are any mineral deficiencies or excesses. And I hate to say it, but I find these are very limited in their usefulness or accuracy in determining whether there are problems relating to the nutrition, particularly with nutrients related to developmental disease in young horses. So there are some feeding and management practices that can contribute to developmental disease, and certainly we need to consider these when we're managing our young horses. Overfeeding, I've been harping on about horses that are growing too rapidly, too quickly, but growing a horse providing too many calories is certainly a problem. You don't want them gaining a huge amount of body fat, which will overload that growing skeleton. We know that regardless of the breed, these larger horses are going to be more likely to have joint problems. And this has been research proven in warm bloods and other breeds, as well as thoroughbreds. So there isn't a simple rule to work out how much is too much to feed our young horses. And as with every horse, we would say design the diet for an individual. It's tricky when you've got paddocks of weanlings out there, but certainly you feed to ensure that their diets are being met. The forage that you have available on your farm will dictate the grain or the feed that's required. So obviously lush, fabulous irrigated pasture, you'll probably need to have a much more completely different feed to someone who's on a dry lot situation. So that's where I recommend talking to a nutritionist and having that diet done for you. Certainly to reduce body condition, choosing lower calorie forages such as a mature grass hay over lucerne, looking at feeding a balancer pellet over a complete feed, and obviously regularly weighing your horses is great. I like to see a couple of ribs on young horses. I think it's protective and it allows you to control weight. A lot of people don't want to see ribs on babies, and I certainly don't want to see them if they're wormy, and I think that possibly some of these two pictures, these horses are not in the best condition, but a rib or two is fine. It's really vital to resist the temptation to pump them full of feed and get those show pony apple bottoms on them and channels down their back. They don't need that extra condition. They're going to ensure, provided you're giving them adequate amounts of protein and the vitamins and minerals for growth, they're going to pump those into growing a sound skeleton. So you don't want to overload those skeleton with calories, which cause them to get fat. Another area that's worth talking about in young horses is protein. Quality protein is really important for growing bone and skeleton and muscle in young horses. It's a very old school form of thought that high protein causes developmental problems. And I often hear good old breeders say, nope, can't feed too much protein, that blows out their knees. And that is not the case. This has been disproven many times over, but the study that's worth mentioning is by Kate Savage and her crew, where they looked at 3 different diets. They fed a control diet to a group of young horses that contained the NRC recommended amount of energy. They fed a high energy diet, so 130% of energy requirements, and they fed a high protein diet, so 130% of protein, recommended protein intake. And they found that the horses on the high energy diet, 11 of those 12 horses had developed OCD lesions, whereas only 1 horse on the control diet developed OCD and only 1 on the high protein diet. So it's pretty clear that high protein wasn't going to cause a problem with DOD or OCD, but the high energy was. So we know that lots of energy leads to rapid weight gain, which leads to an increased incidence of OCD. But we also know that the source of the calories are probably important as well. And there's been some hypotheses presented that show that high blood sugar and insulin response to a meal can be implicated in the pathogenesis of some of this disease, which is thought that these hormonal responses or extreme hormonal responses will interfere with the cartilage development. KER did some work, oh gosh, look at that, 19 years ago now, that looked at the relationship between glycemic response and the incidence of OCD in weanling thoroughbreds, again in Kentucky. So over 200 horses used in this study. These were raised on a commercial farm. They were fed a commercial breeding feed. and regularly weighed and body condition scored. So they were in pretty good nick. What they did, these horses were then x-rayed in their survey x-rays, and the incidence of OCD was recorded. During this study, they were given a glycemic response test. So they were brought into the barn, they were given a known amount of sugar or non-structural carbohydrate, and their blood samples were taken over a period of several hours, and their insulin and glucose response to that diet or to that bolus of sugar was measured. What they found was the population as a whole, there is about a 12% incidence of OCD, but they found that plasma glucose and insulin response to that bolus of carbohydrate was higher in the horses that went on to have OCD. So a high glucose and insulin response to a meal was associated with joint disease. These horses that had high glucose and insulin responses had extreme glucose and insulin responses. So the bolus of carbohydrate was given and the glucose and insulin shot up higher than the average for the population. So it doesn't mean that you feed a high glycemic diet and it causes OCD. It just means that there was a link between the glycemic response that that horse exhibited and the incidence of OCD down the track. So based on that study, it's been recommended that diets for these young growing horses contain calorie sources that don't cause a large spike in blood sugar and insulin. So therefore, reducing the reliance on cereal grains and sugars and molasses in the diet and increasing the amount of fat and fibre. So you'll see that good quality breeding feeds on the market contain high levels of fat and fibre as their calorie source and reduced amounts of grain because of this research. So reducing the risk of DOD through nutrition is important. Broodmare nutrition, vital, monitoring growth rates, balanced nutrition during growth, and feeding a low glycemic feed are all ways to reduce the risk. So how do we feed our yearlings? So once the horses reach 12 months of age, they're less likely to develop some of these developmental diseases. If you do see clinically significant lesions or joint effusion, etc., after 12 months of age, it's usually as a result of something that's occurred or that's formed at a younger age, and this has been research shown. Again, as yearlings, correct nutrient balance is important, and growth management, again, important, and managing how these horses are growing depending on their career or whether they're being prepped for sale. So when you're feeding the yearling, there's some considerations. Interestingly, as the spring pasture in temperate climates, as the spring pasture flush occurs, these horses will gain condition during that springtime. They're also reaching puberty at this time, and that's sort of believed to be linked to a growth spurt as well. Colts are going to probably need more calories than fillies. They tend to be more active during this time. And certainly if they're out in fields with other colts, they're fighting and carrying on. So again, more calories might be needed than colts. If you've got good grass, careful not to overfeed during this time. So a balancer pellet or vitamin mineral supplement to balance out that good grass is great. If you're entering show or sale prep, increasing the caloric intake is important, but again, monitoring body condition scores so they don't get too fat. In these scenarios, a breeding feed, so fed at a higher intake per day, plus added oil, soaked beet pulp or stabilised rice bran is ideal for adding condition to these horses. So throughout the course of this talk, the bottom line is that the skeleton is probably the area that's growing incredibly fast and rapidly during this time. And bone is something that every horseman or every horse person knows is important. We know that when they're born, they've got a very small amount of adult of bone mineral, so only 17% of adult bone mineral content. And it's known that maximum bone mineral content is not achieved until 6 years of age, which I think is quite profound, because if you think about what we do with horses prior to 6 years of age, it's quite astounding, particularly with some of these industries where we're expecting 2-year-olds to gallop full speed around a track on very immature bones. So obviously it goes without saying we want these bones to be as well developed as possible. Certainly there's a lot of nutrition that's required to grow bone, decent amounts of calories, proteins, trace minerals, vitamins are really important. But how do we maximise that? We know that exercise is really important for bone. We certainly know that in humans that certainly exercising every day will keep our bones strong, and we know that some sort of level of impact on the bone will cause it to lay down mineral. We know that horses that are out at free choice exercise, grazed in paddocks where they're allowed to play and carry on with their mates, will have nice strong bone. There's a lot of research to back this up too. So various study groups throughout the world have put a groups of young horses under controlled exercise and seen improvements in bone mineral content. So weanlings put on the walker or hand walked or lunged is helpful for building bone, and certainly some work that I helped with in New Zealand years ago looked at controlled sprint exercise in young horses, young thoroughbreds, plus being turned out at pasture, showed these horses had bigger and better bone, which actually persisted through to 3-year-old racing. So interestingly, that locking them up in stables, it's kind of clear, locking them up in stables isn't going to help with bone development. KER is really focused on bone research because we believe it's an area that's obviously vital for sound athletic performance. We know that bone's very elastic, it's constantly changing, so you can actually influence it a lot with nutrition and exercise. We did a pilot study looking at weanlings raised on a Kentucky farm again, where we measured their bone mineral content throughout their growing period, and we can see this graph on this slide here shows that the bone mineral density increased over their weanling period and then dropped off in the winter months. And this is probably related to the fact that Kentucky winters are really cold and these horses were probably kept inside for some of the time, and their bone mineral dropped off due to lack of exercise and possibly seasonal effects as well. We want to know whether we can influence that bone mineral because obviously bone that's not holding enough mineral will be weak and subject to injury. So a second study was performed looking at a new supplement that we've developed called Triactin, where we fed this to these weanlings. And so we had a control group that were fed a balanced ration. We've had a treatment group that were fed the balanced ration plus this product called Triactin. These horses were radiographed and we measured the bone mineral content of their cannon bones of their front leg, and we looked at various views of the cannon bone, but the one that's important that we found some really interesting results was looking at the lateral medial view, so looking from the outside of the bone or the side of the leg through the bone, and we saw some pretty significant changes in bone density looking through that bone. So we found there that if you look at that graph on the bottom right hand corner, we saw an increased bone density in the weanlings that were fed that product and that expected drop in bone mineral density in the control horses. So we were able to attenuate that drop or that seasonal drop of bone mineral. So interestingly, this is the first research that we're aware of where feeding a supplement actually has an effect on building bone. And this has also been repeated in mature horses and race horses, particularly in relation to issues such as shin soreness or bucked shins. If you're from the US, we know that that's related to reduced bone mineral content in the horse, and so Triactin was able to attenuate that drop in bone mineral as well. So quite an interesting path of research that we'll be continuing on. So in conclusion, I hope that I've drummed into you that slow and steady growth is really important for growing a sound skeleton, regardless of the career of the horse, whether you've got a beautiful warm blood dressage horse, a show jumper, your trail riding horse, your show pony, your racehorse, you need to grow that skeleton soundly. So therefore it's important to manage the growth of these young horses. We recommend adjusting the calorie intake or the energy intake so that you don't have fat, porky little babies running around paddocks because you'll overload the skeleton. As with all horses, roughage or forage is the foundation of all diet. So start there when you're designing your diet and then build on that to bridge those gaps in nutrition. So adequate protein, really important for young horses. Don't be shy. And balanced vitamin and mineral intake, and particularly those trace minerals that are important for bone and cartilage development, so zinc, copper, iodine, manganese, etc. And then it would be prudent to feed low glycemic energy sources, so those looking at calories from high fat and high fibre that don't cause a massive blood sugar increase after the horses consume them. I'd like to invite any questions and also call upon my colleagues, Dr. Huntington, David Nash and Rebecca Ham, to help with these questions, because I've done a lot and they have also got a huge amount of knowledge between them. So thanks very much, and yeah, I look forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, so we have a few that have come through. So one of the first ones was from Zoe, and she said she's moving from a dry property in Western New South Wales, she doesn't say exactly where, down to the Yarra Valley in November or December. Her mare is due at the end of September, so we'll have a foal. How do I make sure it doesn't affect the foal's growth?
So, sorry, the foals will be born in the Yarra Valley or in New South Wales?
New South Wales. It'll come down with her.
With the mare.
Yeah.
All right. So it's probably will depend on what arriving to in the Yarra Valley, although judging by the rain in the last wee while, I'd say it's probably going to be quite green. As long as you're providing that broodmare with adequate nutrition at the moment, so she's got to make sure she's got a decent body condition and she's getting those trace minerals in the last trimester of pregnancy and decent forage, you should be fine once that foal arrives in the Yarra Valley, that the mare may be okay to go straight onto a balancer, but you really have to assess it when they get there and see how that mare and foal goes. But we'd be happy to help with that guide advice once you're there or once you head there. Dr. H, any questions? So you're closer to the Yarra Valley than I am.
I think one would expect there to be more pasture on the ground in the Yarra Valley than in far western New South Wales, and that'll help the mare maintain condition and maintain her milk output, and could well encourage some good growth in the young horse. So you may not need to feed as much, and certainly wouldn't need to feed as much hay.
Okay, so the next question is from Marie. And she's got a 3-year-old Shire filly, and she's worried that it might be growing too quickly. She's still very bum high. How long should this continue on for, and what should she do?
These heavier breeds mature more slowly, and so ideally they're going to go through a period of zigzagging croup high, balancing out croup high until they get to that mature stage. And certainly with the heavy horses, you can see that happening beyond 3 years of age, I'm sorry to say. I would make sure that she's not carrying too much body condition, so providing them a balanced diet, but again, you don't want to see that typical apple bottom and huge amounts of covering over the ribs. So again, a diet analysis is probably a good idea to make sure you're providing her with the nutrition to grow her skeleton, which will be huge, and but not allowing her to get too fat. So the croup high is just a growing pattern that we do see in these young horses, particularly the bigger breeds, and she should balance out provided you're not giving her too many calories.
One from Greg. Greg asks, you mentioned about young horses being too fat too quickly. If young horses are too heavy, how do you get weight off them if they're not in work yet? Do you just put them in a yard, or is it best to keep them in a paddock?
That'll depend on your paddock. It also depends on the age of the horse. So if you've decided that your young horse, and I'm talking, it's tricky not knowing what age we're talking about here, but let's go with, say, weanling age. They've come off the mare, they're on decent pasture, and they're looking really fat. Well, you're not going to stick them on a lunge rope and work the hell out of them. Or work them a lot. You're going to look at what roughage they're getting and what feed they're getting. If they're not getting any feed, they're on decent pasture, you're going to have to restrict the intake of that pasture and provide them with a lower quality, then provide them with a balancer to top up the nutrition. If they're a little bit older, probably similar scenario. But yeah, you don't want to obviously be working them if they're super young, but it's a tricky one to answer if they're without knowing the age of the horse.
Okay. I've got one from Amber through Facebook, and she asks, what's the best type of hay for a weanling to 2-year-old, grass or lucerne? She doesn't have any pasture at all.
Depends on the breed, depends on what else you have. Got no pasture, I would always go with a combination of grass and lucerne, but again, it depends on the quality of that grass or the lucerne. I'd always go for a higher quality roughage, regardless of species, over a particular type, one or the other. But if it's a breed that tends to be a better doing horse, that gains weight rapidly, I would suggest going with a more grassy hay than lucerne, but lucerne contains really high quality protein and good calories for growth. So it's perfectly fine to have lucerne as your fibre source. You just might find that these horses gain a lot of weight. So it depends on the fibre you have available and the analysis of that fibre.
Mm-hmm. We've got one question saying, I'm a student and wondering if all of these diseases can also be seen in donkeys.
Good question. I don't know, Dr. Huntington.
No, I think that'd be a question for David, wouldn't it? That one, no.
My horses
breed
did have long
donkeys.
I think that might be one good one for us to take on notice and actually report back in our series.
That's true, because Rebecca's going to be presenting about sport horses, and donkeys may well fall into that category.
Yeah, great.
I think yes, they can be present in donkeys, but donkeys are usually not being fed or managed the same way and don't have the same expectations of early growth and development that many other horse breeds do. So that might be a difference. But you can get OCD in wild horses, for example.
That's true. Yeah.
A lot lower degree. So I think there's no reason to think that you won't get it in donkeys, although maybe it's not as big an issue as, say, laminitis is in donkeys.
Mm-hmm. We've got lots of questions. Okay. Do you consider feeding MSM helpful for joint and cartilage development? That's from Marina.
Oh, how do I answer that one? Possibly.
Do you want some help, Clarissa?
No, I'm just wondering whether I put a commercial spin on it or not. So no, okay, you can answer that because you are the veterinarian on the panel.
There's some theoretical benefits as a source of sulfur, available sulfur. But however, no direct research to prove it, and we would generally say you want to have some direct research before you really hang your hat on the benefits of something.
Okay, so I've got one from Angela. So she's got a small herd of 6-month-old Welsh Mountain Pony weanlings, no pasture, on first grade barley hay ad lib. Should they also be fed hard feed, and if so, what is best?
Alrighty, so for young ponies, and you've got barley hay, okay, so I would suggest a balancer pellet for these young horses. It depends on their body condition on that hay, but I would imagine, being Welshies, they're probably looking pretty good. And so you do need to provide them with the nutrition that's lacking in that hay. So roughages typically contain decent amounts of energy, decent amounts of protein depending on the roughage. I'd say that your barley hay is probably okay for protein maybe, but it will be lacking in those important minerals for bone development. So I would look at a balancer pellet that's fed at a low intake that provides those substrates for growth but doesn't necessarily provide additional calories for weight gain. So I won't name brands because we're going to keep it not commercial today, but certainly talk to a nutritionist and they'll balance that out for you.
Rissi, and with barley hay, you need to make sure that potentially it could be a failed crop, so there might be a lot of grain in that hay.
I was wondering that too, yeah, whether that's cut and whether the barley's been removed from that hay or not too. So again, that if there's seed head in that hay, it's going to be much, much higher in calories. And you'll also possibly want to be thinking about the calcium phosphorus balance as well in that diet. So yeah, probably best to get that hay analysed and have a nutritionist balance that diet for you.
There's another question about barley hay too. Is there too much sugar in barley hay coming from Haley? So, and the answer is,
look,
go ahead.
Probably. It depends on the hay. It depends on the hay, really. If it's full of grain, probably going to have calories from the sugar, and whether that will be a problem for some horses. I say for some horses it will be an issue, for others it won't be. So it depends again on the analysis of that hay. You guys can feel free to jump in on the grain
and the amount you feed.
But if you're relying on it as your sole source of roughage, you know, ad lib potentially will be a problem.
You can get it analysed, you can get hay analysed. There are some labs in different states that do hay analysis, and that would give you a better handle on its suitability. You know, barley hay is probably going to be lower protein, like oat and hay, lower protein than many grass hays or legumes, and but 2-year-old growth is starting to slow down, so it's not as vital as it might be with a weanling.
What type of oil would you recommend most? Here's another question.
Right. Well, you can, there's various oils available. We'd certainly say some sort of vegetable oil is important if you want to add calories to the diet. We have been focusing our research looking at specific types of oils for benefits in the inflammation category, so omega-3 oils. There's a fair bit of work done with feeding a fish oil to horses of various ages. So I'd probably recommend, if you're looking at adding calories to the diet, a plain vegetable oil that's available at your feed stores good. If you want to make sure that, particularly if that horse is not on green grass, I'd look at potentially balancing out those omegas in the diet with providing some fish oil or linseed oil, which is high in omega-3. But fish oil is a long chain omega-3 oil, which provides some great anti-inflammatory benefits.
I can talk about the conception benefits next week or the week after.
Oh, exactly. Yes, and your breeding horses, indeed.
At what age do you cut back protein content for warm blood, presuming they are broken in, and start light work at around 3.5 years of age?
It depends on how much we're talking about cutting back. Their protein requirements will still be relatively significant if you're working them and you're requiring them to exercise quite heavily. So we sort of look at 3 years of age, 4 years of age, when they're steadying out their growth to start considering whether they need to go onto a performance horse feed as opposed to a breeding feed. But again, it will depend on the horse. Protein is pretty important for a horse that's in work as well as a growing horse. So protein is probably the one that you want to still keep at a decent level.
Okay. We've got here, we operate a breeding farm that prepares horses for yearling sales. We have been weighing the weanlings and are happy with their condition, but there is a lot of variance in their average daily weight gains. What would be the optimal daily growth rate of a horse? We're currently working on approximately 500 grams a day.
That's what I'd be looking at this time, assuming you're in Australia, looking at this time of year. 500 grams a day would be what you want to see. It's sometimes tricky when you're looking at average daily gain when you're weighing these horses, because of course you're only really comparing it between two weighings, and so depending on gut fill, for example, you're going to have a little bit of wiggle. So that average daily gain graph that I showed you of those 25,000 thoroughbreds was quite nice and smooth, but if you look at an individual horse, it's all over the show because we're only looking at a certain amount of weight points. So again, I'd be looking at half a kilo per day, but don't be too worried if those fluctuate. You really just want to make sure, certainly visually, that horse is looking okay, and their body weight is moving at a regular growth.
There is also Grow Track.
Well, yes, of course.
Tell us
would like
about
some help with that. You may well be using Grow Track, but if you would like to investigate our free program for breeders, which has a whole lot of growth curves entered into it that you can use to compare the growth of your young horses, not just thoroughbreds, but standardbreds, quarter horses, Arabs, warm bloods, etc. Contact us and we'll send you a download link, and you can enter all your data in and see how they're growing compared to the rest of the population. It's a really great tool.
We've got a question from Dot. So she's asking you talked a lot about exercising growing horses, and she's in a region that is getting a lot of rain, so the yards are very muddy. Does heavy, muddy yards during movement create more stress on young horses' bones and cause problems?
I guess it can. I'll open that one to the panel. It depends.
I think what it's going to do is it may be more an issue with soft tissue, may increase the risk of soft tissue injuries and certainly increase the risk of mud fever and rain scald, neither of which are the worst things that can ever happen to a horse, but you possibly get a little bit less concussion from that. And so the bone responds, as Clarissa said, bone responds to concussion in developing increased density. And so you may be stimulating bone density a little bit less than you would be normally.
We've actually got a couple of questions about horses that are being stabled due to injury. So I'm just going to combine these couple of questions. And basically they're asking, Rosemary's asking, based on the current research results, would you expect triactin to be beneficial for weanlings and yearlings that are on stable and yard rest for a few weeks due to medical issues, if they are already on good quality forage and a commercial concentrate that meets their requirements?
Yes, and we've shown that and we haven't done it with weanlings that have been locked up, but we have shown that in mature horses that have been locked up for injury's sake, when they're fed that product, their bone doesn't demineralize as rapidly as it would even on a balanced diet. So yes, I highly recommend it for that situation.
Yeah, I guess just an extension to that question, Judy kind of asked the same, but is there any other considerations that I need to take into consideration when the horse is being stabled or the weanling is being stabled for a couple of months?
I would, sorry, one more time.
What should I do if a weanling needs to be stabled for a couple of months?
All right, so I would, again, they may not need to have, need to have their diet balanced. They need to have decent amount of roughage available to them the whole time, including during the night. So a slow feeder hay net, a balanced diet to meet their requirements, but I'd also recommend the triactin supplement if they're not able to be turned out at all for exercise purposes. So again, you'd probably just have to monitor their body condition to make sure that they're gaining enough condition or maintaining their condition. So that's probably going to come from the forage or the feed choice that you make for them.
Mm-hmm.
And to think about temperament, to their behaviour, how they handle the state.
Yeah, provide them with a toy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, feed and entertainment and company, yes.
Sounds like lockdown.
No wine for them though. No wine.
No wine, no mask. Got it.
I'm just trying to sort through some of these questions. We've actually got a question about about a ration with a mineral balance for foals developing on pasture known to cause big head.
All right. So big head is a situation where we need to take into consideration the calcium in the diet. So if you are grazing high oxalate pastures or tropical pastures such as Kikuyu, you do need to take into consideration the calcium in the diet to make sure that those young horses are not going to develop that issue. This is where I would say that you should definitely have your roughages analysed and talk to a nutritionist to get that balance. So I would say that a lot of the breeding feeds probably take that into account. If you're feeding them at the correct amount, they will have enough, or they may have enough calcium in them. But I would say you should always double check that. So providing a calcium supplement on top of that would be prudent. But again, each individual situation, you would need to look at the body condition of that foal. It's not just a matter of putting in more feed. You might need to provide a calcium supplement on top of that. So, and also looking at high calcium roughages such as lucerne to supplement the diet.
Probably important, Lucy, to look at making sure that they just don't give too much calcium, because then that can start binding up other minerals as well. They give huge amounts.
Yeah, so again, it's important if you've got a situation like that and you're growing young horses on that tropical pasture to talk to a nutritionist to make sure that diet's balanced for an individual circumstance.
Question from Candice. Are there specific supplements that are best for weanlings? I'm not sure if she's referring to vitamins and minerals or...
I think when you're designing a diet for a horse, you always start with forage. So what you've got available or what roughage you can buy in. You balance the nutrition that's lacking in those for the horse that you've got, the type of horse and the age that it is. So that would be using your balancer pellets or your full feed. And then any gaps in the diet that still might be missing, you add a supplement. So it really depends on what's missing or what might be needed in your horse's diet. So I guess the biggest thing, if you're looking at supplements for a weanling, is what is happening in the rest of its diet. So that's again where I would say talk to a nutritionist, have a diet analysis done, and if you've got any gaps, fill them up with a supplement. But it's not a great idea to go to your feed store and go, oh, that looks like a good supplement, or they say that's good for weanlings, let's buy it. It's a matter of balancing out the gaps in nutrition, because there are a range of nutrients that horses do need to survive and to grow properly. And so if you get that diet analysed, you'll work out where those gaps might be.
Cool. One from Sarah saying she actually uses Tractin in her race horses already, but she also has a 6-month-old foal. When can she start feeding it?
It's perfectly safe to feed now. I'd recommend if you've got it there and you're feeding your race horses it, I'd put your babies on it too.
That's lower dose, 60 gram dose.
Yeah, the dose is on the box.
Yep.
What's a good feed for a mare in foal due mid-April? I've just bought her. It's been 10 years since I've had a pregnant mare. She's a 12-hand Welsh A. That's from Sinead.
So I'm assuming you are in Australia. So you've got an autumn-born baby happening, which is very exciting. You need to make sure that mare during the summer months probably depends on where you are and depends on the fibre that she has available to you. But you will want to make sure that she has decent amounts of forage. She doesn't get too fat, so probably having her on a balancer pellet, and certainly making sure she's getting the right nutrition in the final trimester of pregnancy is really important. And then being born in the autumn is actually quite advantageous for a foal. We did some work looking at thoroughbreds born in the autumn, and they're born obviously leading into the cooler months. They're on their mare, they're on the mother, which is providing them with great nutrition throughout the winter, and then they're weaned into the spring. So they're actually weaned into a time where nutrition is improving. So they often don't show that drop in or as significant drop in growth rate after weaning. So it's quite an interesting time to breed horses. Certainly for Welshies, they tend to gain weight really easily. So you're probably looking at the other end of the spectrum to make sure that the mare doesn't get too fat, that she stays in a healthy body condition, that she doesn't get a cresty neck. So probably just a balance is all she's going to need to provide that growing baby with enough nutrition, and then monitor the roughage when the foal's born so that the mare produces enough milk for the young growing foal in the winter.
Ooh, and we've actually got a question, which I'm not sure who's going to be able to answer this one, but we've actually got a question from someone in Pakistan asking for what options there are to balance diets, because lameness is quite prevalent, and I think one disposing factor is poor nutrition. Any ideas?
I think there would be quite an inverted calcium phosphorus ratio, but depending on some of the novel raw materials that they feed in the subcontinent. So working out exactly what they're feeding to their diet, and then for us filling the blanks or the gaps into that diet to recorrect potentially a cal-phos imbalance or any other mineral imbalance in the diet.
Cool.
Lucerne, you can often get fresh lucerne in that part of the world. And we also work with a company in Delhi that makes good horse feed, some good horse feed, Himalayan horse feeds. So, but if you can get that from Delhi across to Pakistan, that could really help.
I think we're almost done with questions, but Molly is just asking, what impact on bone and growth does having a 2-year-old young thoroughbred in full racing work mean?
Well, certainly if you've grown that young thoroughbred properly and it's got a nice strong skeleton, working them at 2 years of age will build bone. It's when you work a horse, and certainly when you work them at fast speeds, you can get micro cracks in the bone. But if you give that horse enough rest, that bone will recover, and it will continue it continues to turn over and heal itself. So provided you don't work that horse in excess with the micro damage that is occurring during fast work, and you allow that horse's bone to recover, there shouldn't be a problem, particularly if you're feeding them a balanced diet. So I don't see major issues providing they're getting decent rest and decent nutrition.
And the last question, which I think we'll do, is how much effect does the weaning process have on the prevalence of ulcers, and how does this affect the growth of young horses?
And a weanling ulcer question. Did we do the research, Pete, or was that done with a different team with weanling ulcers and weanlings?
It was done in England, and it was, there's quite a few ulcers in weanlings. But it's hard to say that that's responsible for the growth setback that they get. But at the time of weaning, I think it depends how you wean, would have to be the number one question. If you do paddock weaning, then less stress, less change of diet. But if you put them in boxes, then you've got some of those, change of diet and stress and reduced forage availability that can increase the risk of ulceration. So I don't think some people might give some omeprazole at that time, particularly if you've got something that was struggling a bit, but it's not necessarily, wouldn't be a routine management procedure.
We should probably mention that triactin has also got a couple of other benefits, not just bone. It's been proven to buffer gastric acid as well as and hindgut acidosis. So it's might be prudent to feed to weanlings, not only for bone benefits but also for the suppression of gastric acid or the reduction of acidity in the gut during that stressful time. Up in my mind, I don't want to get commercial in this talk, but that's probably a good point to mention.
Perfect. Well, that's the end of the questions, so we might wrap it up there. So thank you so much for attending. I'll just hand over very quickly to David just to do a quick little introduction to his webinar in a couple of weeks on the 3rd of September. And I'll just put the registration link for that in the chat box. So anybody that wants to register is able to do that. So, David?
Thanks for that. So I'm going to focus on our area in our series of reasons. And I'll talk about conception and fertility. So we'll talk about stallion fertility and the benefits of nutritional and also management to ensure that the stallion's in the right form, but also we'll talk about if he is subfertile, methods of using nutrition actually enhance that. We'll also talk about conception mares, whether they be first parity mares, normal mares, subfertile mares, but also like the late old mares, trying to make sure that we give them their chance to conceive, because it's such a hard task sometimes that we want to put all that investment in our mares. We want that little baby foal at the end of our barrier and make sure that all the work is worth it. So that is in 3 weeks, is that correct?
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see.
David, I'm just going to jump in because your sound is really not clear. So what we might do is fix that technological fault and have you come on at a later date to advertise the talk about fertility and how to boost fertility through nutrition. It's going to be a really fabulous talk, but unfortunately you sound like you're underwater and had too many wines. So well, I should have stopped you, but it was kind of entertaining.
Perfect. All right.
Someone thinks you're a robot, Dave. So there
it does sound kind of robotic. I was going to say you should be on the Muppet Show, but
it's artificial intelligence going there.
Perfect. So, all right. So thank you guys all for attending. That registration link is in the chat box for anybody that does want to register. And we'll have take 2 of David introducing his topic in next week. So we'll do a special one for him. So thank you all for attending.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.